Hi, Joy of Cooking students. Welcome to my video tutorial about your soup stations. The theme for these ingredients is these are all things that we simmer in liquid to give us broth or stock, to give us a flavorful, nutritious base for soups. Oftentimes, these ingredients are removed and they are not used in the resulting soup that you make with that flavored liquid. So what I'm going to do is show you samples of some of these, go through the questions so that you can check the answers on your worksheet. And this is kind of self-paced. So if at any point you need to pause the video so that you can write things down or correct your work or fill things in, you have the ability to do so. So I'm going to start with number one. Number one you remember as bouillon cubes. So 1A asked you to identify bouillon. That's spelled B-O-U-I-L-L-O-N. B asked you to describe their use. So this is a convenient way to make broth. You would dissolve these cubes in water to make broth or stock. You do have to watch, though, the sodium content. We'll come back to that in a minute. Number two, you were to analyze this picture. 2A asks, what is the top layer in that measuring cup? And that's a layer of fat. You can see in the picture that lighter layer is a layer of fat. B asked what should be done with that. It should be discarded. You do not mix that back in and use that to make your soup. There are some ways to do that. You can use a baster to kind of squeeze out the broth down below. You can use one of these measuring cups. When you pour it, the fat basically kind of sinks to the bottom and the resulting liquid is what comes out. You can also let this cool and then scrape the fat off the top. B asks what's another name for broth? C, and your answer is stock. C is stock. Number three, I had you take a look at this picture. 3A says identify. This is a soup bone. 3A is soup bone. What is at the center? The center of bone is marrow. And you can see in the picture that marrow, M-A-R-R-O-W. That's bone marrow. 3, why is this a preferred ingredient for making homemade broth? Because it's flavorful and nutritious. 3C, it's got the flavor and the nutrients. So, I mean, taking a look at this, you can see there's not much meat to it. It's the bone and the center marrow. So you would just cook this away in water to make a flavorful broth, to make flavored liquid. D asks, is this eaten? The answer is no. Some restaurants do serve marrow as a delicacy, but certainly after simmering, for hours in your liquid, it wouldn't have any of the nutrients or flavor anymore. So D is no. 4A, I asked you to take a look at the nutrition label on a can of prepared broth. 4A asked, why use canned broth instead of making it from scratch? Well, you've got the convenience factor. It'll save you time. Yes, if you want to make beef broth, you can simmer and cook down these bones for hours. Or you can just open up a can of broth. I said the same with bouillon. You've got your convenience factor. So A is, it's faster, takes less time, it's convenient. B, whenever you have a convenience food, though, there's usually sodium. It's a preservative. So how much sodium is in a serving? B is 860 milligrams. That's 36% of your daily value, and that's in half of this can. There are 2 servings in the can. So in half a can, you have almost your daily supply of salt. For C asks, what is the disadvantage of using canned broth over homemade? Well, the salt content, and you don't have control over what goes into it. Obviously, if you're making yours from scratch, you control exactly what goes into it and how much salt or sodium. Number 5, I showed you this is a beef bone. This is used to make beef broth. And then back at station 5, we had various chicken pieces. So that would be used to make a chicken broth. So 5A asks you to identify the pieces. 5A is a thigh. 5A, thigh. B, you could say leg, or more specifically, this is a drumstick. 5B, drumstick. 5C, the larger piece, this is chicken breast. C is chicken breast. And 5D is a chicken wing. Interestingly, the most common use for chicken wings in the United States is by soup companies to make broth. Yes, they're eaten on their own as appetizers and wings, but more likely they're used to flavor liquid to make broth. Now, some follow-up questions on those pieces. BS, what are the advantages of using these pieces to make broth? They're inexpensive and they're flavorful. I purchased all 4 pieces from Redner's for about $2. So they're inexpensive. C, how are the pieces removed from the liquid to produce the resulting stock? You would cook these ingredients in water and then use your strainer to strain away the broth. So the pieces of meat and bone that remain, you would discard. I said you would not use that in the resulting soup. And D, name a use for this type of broth. You could say chicken noodle soup is probably the most obvious. Anything that starts at the base of chicken broth. So you could see all of these pieces had the bone in. That's why they're less expensive as well. The more things are processed, the more work it takes to get it to you, like removing the skin, removing the fat, removing the bone, that increases the price. So that's why I said these are relatively inexpensive, but they've got the flavor, so they're great for making broth. However, in number 6, you identified this is ham, 6A is ham. B, why is this cut of meat not used in making broth? It's got no bone. So unlike my beef soup bone, unlike the chicken pieces, this has no bone. Letter B. C, how might you use that? You might use the ham itself in the soup, not necessarily to flavor and make the broth. So B, a soup that might have ham in it is ham and bean soup. That's kind of a Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. D, ham and bean soup. Number 7, again, the theme here is adding flavor. So a lot of these herbs and spices we would use to flavor something, but in the end would not eat them. So station 7, first of all, has some vegetables. How are these used to flavor broth? You would just cook these in liquid. B, how are these items prepared? You can add them whole, you can add them chopped. For the carrot, you wouldn't even have to peel it. Again, you're not eating these in your soup, you're just using them for their flavor to get a broth. And then B, how are these pieces removed? Again, you would run it through a strainer. The resulting liquid is what I would use for my soup base, and I would discard those soggy vegetables. Now, A are herbs and spices. 8A asked you to identify. A are cloves. These are whole cloves. C-L-O-V-E-S. They kind of have a cinnamony, nutmeg kind of smell and flavor to them. Pretty strong cloves. B, identify this herb. These are bay leaves. Bay leaves. And then it asks, is this herb served in the final product? No. So if you get a soup or a stew and you have a bay leaf floating around in it, the chef didn't do something right. I add these when I'm making my chili, and I cook it in the chili for about 30 minutes. I remove the bay leaves right before serving. So B is bay leaves. Is this served in the final product? No. C, these are black peppercorns. These are whole peppercorns. These, again, are used for flavoring, but strained out, not served in the final product. Imagine these and your cloves, chewing on those. They're pretty hard. You wouldn't want to chew them. And last, 8D, I have both dried and fresh. This herb is parsley. When is this ingredient added? This is added, unlike these others that are simmered away and added at the very beginning. Parsley is added at the very end. And this is usually to kind of give it some freshness and some color. So we have dried and fresh. These are parsley leaves. When is this added, 8D asked? At the very end. So again, the overall focus here was on preparing broth or stock, which is the basis for your soup. We prefer cuts of meat with bone because they've got the flavor, the nutrients, and they're relatively inexpensive. The key is once you simmer these away in hot water, the resulting flavorful liquid is your broth or stock, and the pieces themselves would be discarded prior to serving.